The evening air was cool, a gentle breeze sweeping through the valley, rustling the olive trees and stirring the grasses on the hillsides. The day had been long, filled with travel, teaching, and healing, but now a serene calm settled over the land. Jesus and his disciples had gathered in a quiet garden at the foot of a hill, away from the noise and bustle of the villages they had visited earlier. It was one of those moments of rest, yet the disciples carried a heaviness in their hearts. As the last of the sunlight faded, casting long shadows across the garden, Jesus gazed at his disciples. He knew their souls were troubled. Though they had witnessed miracles, heard divine wisdom from his lips, and felt the powerful presence of God, there was still a sense of restlessness in their spirits. It wasn't doubt in him, they had come to trust him completely, but rather an internal battle, a deep longing for a kind of peace and spiritual well-being that seemed just out of reach. The night was quiet, the only sounds being the soft hum of distant crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Jesus saw that each of his disciples carried burdens, some known, others unspoken. He could see the weariness in their eyes, the weight of the questions they were too afraid to voice aloud. John, the beloved disciple, sat closest to Jesus, his young face etched with a deep longing. Though he had walked beside Jesus for many months, his heart was heavy with uncertainty. John often felt as though he wasn't strong enough for the mission ahead. His soul was restless, and though he prayed and meditated on Jesus' words, there was still a part of him that felt disconnected, as if he were reaching for something he couldn't grasp. Next to him, Peter, usually bold and strong, had been uncharacteristically quiet. His face was hard to read, but beneath his strong exterior, Peter carried the heavy weight of fear of failure, fear of inadequacy. He had always been quick to act, quick to speak, but lately, he had begun to wonder if he was truly capable of fulfilling the calling placed on his life. He loved Jesus deeply, but that love only amplified his fear of falling short. And then there was Thomas. His heart often wavered between faith and doubt. He believed in Jesus, had seen the miracles, had felt the presence of God, but his rational mind always demanded more proof, more certainty. He didn't want to doubt, but it was as if a cloud followed him, always shadowing his faith with questions that never seemed to have easy answers. Each disciple was carrying something, an unseen burden, a spiritual hunger for something deeper, something more than just following the Messiah physically. They needed spiritual well-being, a deep-rooted peace that could withstand the trials and uncertainties of life. Jesus, ever attuned to the hearts of those he loved, could feel the weight of their spirits. He knew the questions they carried in their hearts. Am I enough? Will I fail? Can I really bear the burdens of this calling? What if I am too weak, too broken? These were not questions they could easily ask aloud, but Jesus knew. He had always known. The quiet rustle of vines along the garden walls caught Jesus' attention. He walked over to a large, twisted vine that spread its branches far and wide. Clusters of ripe grapes hung from the branches, their deep purple skins glistening in the moonlight. Jesus, always the master teacher, saw an opportunity to give his disciples the spiritual nourishment their hearts craved. "Come," he said softly, gesturing for them to gather closer. The disciples, sensing that something profound was about to happen, moved closer to their master, sitting in a semicircle around him. "Look at this vine," Jesus began, his voice gentle yet full of authority. "Do you see how the branches stretch wide, how the fruit hangs heavy? Do you see how the vine is the source of life for the branches? Without the vine, the branches would wither and die, but because they are connected, they flourish and bear much fruit." The disciples looked at the vine, nodding slowly. They had seen such vines countless times, but tonight, there was a deeper significance in Jesus' words. They knew he was not just talking about plants. There was something more, something about their own lives, their own spiritual journey, that he was revealing. Jesus continued, his eyes filled with love and understanding. "A vine must be cared for, pruned, and nurtured. A wise gardener knows which branches to prune and which to leave so that they might bear even more fruit. But the branches do not need to worry about how much fruit they will bear. Their only task is to remain connected to the vine. The life that flows through the vine will sustain them, nourish them, and cause them to grow. As Jesus spoke, the disciples felt the weight of his words sinking into their hearts. There was a truth here that went beyond the metaphor. They were the branches, Jesus the vine. But how could they, with all their weaknesses and doubts, remain strong enough to stay connected? They feared the pressures of life would break them, cause them to wither. Yet, Jesus was offering something deeper, a promise that their strength didn't come from themselves but from their connection to him. Peter, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke. His voice trembled, betraying the emotion he had been holding back. Lord, what happens if a branch is weak? What if it cannot bear fruit? Is it cut off and thrown away? His question hung in the air, heavy with fear and vulnerability. Peter had always prided himself on being strong, but deep inside, he feared his strength might not be enough. He feared that in a moment of weakness he might fail Jesus. Jesus turned to Peter, his expression full of compassion. He knew Peter's heart better than Peter knew it himself. He stepped forward and placed a hand on Peter's shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. Peter, Jesus said gently, the gardener does not abandon a branch just because it is weak. He cares for it, gives it time to grow, and prunes it so that it might become even stronger. It is not the strength of the branch that matters, but its connection to the vine. As long as the branch remains connected, it will bear fruit. Peter's eyes filled with tears. His chest felt tight as he fought to hold them back, but Jesus' words had touched a place deep inside him, a place that had been burdened for so long. His strength, his ability, his worth, they didn't come from himself. They came from his connection to Jesus. The weight he had been carrying for so long began to lift, and a single tear rolled down his cheek. The other disciples watched in silence, many of them beginning to feel the same release. It wasn't just Peter who felt weak. They all did. They all had moments where they feared they weren't enough, moments where their faith wavered, moments where they felt disconnected from the source of life. And yet, here was Jesus, telling them that it wasn't their strength that mattered. It was their connection to him. Seeing the impact of his words, Jesus began to tell a story, one that would resonate deeply with each of them. There was once a man, Jesus began, who lived in a beautiful vineyard. The vines there were lush, full of life, and bore the most exquisite fruit. But this man, despite living in such abundance, believed there was something more to be found beyond the vineyard. He thought that he could find something better if he ventured out on his own. And so, he left the vineyard, wandering far away, deeper and deeper into the wilderness. The disciples listened closely, their hearts already beginning to ache for the man in the story. They could feel his desire, his longing for something more, but they could also sense the mistake he had made in leaving the vineyard, in abandoning the source of life. As the man wandered, Jesus continued, he found himself in a vast, barren desert. There was no life there, only dryness, heat, and endless stretches of sand. The man grew thirsty, his body weak, his spirit heavy. He searched for water, for any sign of life, but found none. The longer he stayed in the desert, the more he began to wither, like a branch cut off from the vine. Jesus' voice grew softer, filled with sorrow. The man realized too late what he had done. He had left the source of life, thinking he could find something greater on his own. But in doing so he had become lost, disconnected, and dying. The disciples' hearts broke for the man in the story. They understood, on a deep level, what it meant to feel disconnected from the source. They had all, at one time or another, felt that spiritual dryness, that sense of wandering in the wilderness without the life-giving presence of Jesus. One day, Jesus continued, as the man was on the verge of collapse, he saw something in the distance, a small vine growing near the base of a withered tree. Its branches were green, its leaves full of life, even in the midst of the desert. The man crawled toward the vine, his body weak, his spirit nearly broken. When he reached it, he clung to it, his hands trembling as he realized that the vine was drawing water from deep beneath the surface. water that he could not see but that was keeping the vine alive. Jesus paused, letting the image of the man clinging to the vine sink into the hearts of his disciples. The man knew, Jesus said softly, that if he let go of the vine he would die. And so he wrapped his arms around it, trusting that as long as he remained connected to the vine he would live. Slowly the man's strength returned. His spirit, once withered and broken, was revived by the life that flowed through the vine. By now many of the disciples had tears in their eyes. John, who had always felt a deep connection to Jesus, was openly weeping, his heart overwhelmed with emotion. He understood, perhaps more than anyone else, the feeling of being that man, lost, wandering, and in desperate need of spiritual nourishment. The story touched a place deep inside him, a place that longed for connection, for the life that only Jesus could give. Peter too was crying. The image of the man clinging to the vine was so vivid in his mind. He had always relied on his strength, his boldness to follow Jesus, but now he realized that it wasn't his strength that would sustain him. It was his connection to Jesus. And in that connection there was life, even in the driest of deserts. Jesus looked at his disciples, his heart full of love for them. He could see their tears, could feel the release of the burdens they had been carrying for so long. "You are like the branches," Jesus said softly, his voice filled with tenderness. "I am the vine. As long as you remain in me you will have life. You will bear much fruit. But apart from me you can do nothing. Do not fear the seasons of dryness, the times when you feel weak or lost. As long as you remain in my love, you will always find life. Even when you feel like the man in the desert, wandering and thirsty, know that I am always with you. I am the vine and you are the branches. Abide in me, and your souls will find rest." At these words, the disciples felt a profound sense of peace wash over them. The tears that had once been full of sorrow were now tears of release, of joy, of deep spiritual healing. They had come to Jesus with heavy hearts, unsure of their place, unsure if they were enough. But now they knew. It wasn't about being enough. It was about being connected to the one who was. Peter, who had been weeping silently, looked up at Jesus, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. "Lord," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I understand now. It is not by my strength, but by your love that I will bear fruit. I will remain in you, Lord, for you are the source of my life." The other disciples, their hearts full, echoed Peter's words, each of them understanding, perhaps for the first time, what it truly meant to abide in Jesus. They no longer had to strive, no longer had to fear their own weaknesses. As long as they remained connected to the vine, they would be sustained, nourished, and made whole. Jesus smiled, his heart full of love for these men who had followed him so faithfully. "My dear friends," he said, "you are never alone. The Father is always with you, tending to you, pruning you so that you may bear even more fruit. Trust in him and your souls will find peace. Remain in me and you will find life." As the night deepened, the stars twinkling brightly in the sky, the disciples walked away from the garden, their hearts lighter, their spirits full of a deep and abiding peace. They had come seeking answers, and they had found something far greater, an unshakable connection to the true vine, the source of all life. And in that connection they knew without a doubt that their souls were well. No matter what trials lay ahead, no matter what deserts they might wander through, they were rooted in the love of Jesus, the vine that would never fail them. This is end of the story. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.